But there's just been a great paper that's just been brought out that says, the recovery scores aren't really showing you anything.
Seriously?
Yeah. So heart rate variability, it's actually been around to give a bit of a history. It's been around for quite a long time. It was a definite health marker, and it was linked to a lot of different diseases and health problems. So that's where it first started, actually. And then it got poured over into sport. The great thing about HRV compared to resting heart rate, if you see a sudden increase in resting heart rate, then you're in a bit of trouble. And I call it the Holy Grail because the Holy Grail.
Dan, welcome to the Roadman podcast.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I'm excited. I'm excited to be totally out of my comfort zone for the next 45 minutes or so.
I'm sure you've heard a lot of this before.
I want to put a post in the ground right at the beginning of this chat, just so there's no confusion as we progress the conversation. Can you explain what heart rate variability is?
Yeah. So heart rate variability, it's actually been around to give a bit of a history. It's been around for quite a long time. It was originally devised as a method of all-cause mortality in health, more than sports performance, as we're going to talk about it today. But the heart rate variability, it's looking at the variation in the gap between heartbeats. So if anyone's ever watched any hospital show and you see that the QRS wave where you have the big peak in the R value, which is where the big wave, and it's where the ventricles contract and they pump blood around the systemic circulation. That is the R value. And what you're essentially doing is you're measuring the gap between heartbeats. So as you and me sit here right now, even if our heart rate is, say, 60 for simplicity, it doesn't mean that every gap is 1 second. It's actually changing every time. So we usually measure in milliseconds. So it might go from 1,000 milliseconds to 800 milliseconds to 600 milliseconds. And that variation in the gap is, in essence, what heart rate variability is. And there's a number of different ways and mathematical measures we can do to measure that. There's things called a time domain analysis, which is pretty much looking at differences in standard deviations. And then there's the spectral analysis, which looks at the frequency of change, so to speak. And the reason we're interested in this is because we know that the variation in heartbeats is linked to our autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is something that we have no control over, but many will know of it as your fight or flight, which is a sympathetic. So when we're stressed, we have heightened sympathetic dominance. And then when we're at rest, or we call it rest and digest, it's more parasympathetic. So it's more to do with digestion and recovery and rest. So if I gave you a fright right now, you feel your heartbeat suddenly in your chest, and that's a sympathetic nervous system kicking into action and taking over from the parasympathetic system. And that's in essence what heart rate variability is. It's a window into the measurement of the autonomic nervous system.
It derived from all-cause mortality. That's interesting. What was their kind of initial application for it?
Well, it was mainly done from a health perspective, but they found that people who had lower heart rate variability generally were less healthy. So it was a definite health marker, and it was linked to a lot of different diseases and health problems. So that's where it first started, actually. And then it got brought over into sport, and even today it's still a very strong indicator of health. I mean, you want a higher heart rate variability. Those who have a really low heart rate variability generally are of the less healthy cohort.
What affects it? Is it, like you're saying, fitness affects it, health affects it? Or sorry, maybe I'm conflating fitness and health. Are they the same thing, or is there a difference? Does age affect it? What other factors are we looking at that affect?
I mean, there's definitely a crossover between fitness and health for sure. I mean, I think we know that when you exercise, it greatly improves your health and it greatly improves your life expectancy. I think there's a great statistic that I always think of is that, you're better off. I mean, exercise is such a potent stimulus for overall health that you're better off smoking and exercising than not exercising and smoking. That's a statistic, right? It's true. So that's how important exercise is in terms of overall health. So there's definitely a crossover. I think there's other things. Obviously, what's the word? The poison is in the dose is in the poison is in the dose, right? So I think crazy amounts of exercise, probably not so much. And that's where we see the opposite side, right? So basically, when people will begin to do an exercise regime, heart rate variability will gradually increase and improve over time. But when we're talking about elite athletes, and this is where my PhD and my research comes into it, you start to see declines in HRV when you are starting to not get the right balance between stress and recovery.
That's super interesting because I've started wearing a Whoop initially I started wearing the Whoop, which we'll come back to in a little bit, when I started using Pillar. So I wanted to get some data for a month leading up to before I started using Pillar, and then have some data to contrast it with after I started using Pillar. But I got a Whoop for both myself and my girlfriend. I'm training probably still. I'm racing Cat 1. I'm relatively active outside that as well with a few runs. Probably racing training 15 to 20 hours most weeks in season. And I noticed that my girlfriend, she's definitely not sedentary, but she's maybe training 5 hours or 6 hours a week. Her heart rate variability was so much higher than mine. She was waking up every day, 110 plus heart rate variability, and mine might be 70, 80 if I was feeling pretty fresh.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with heart rate variability is it's very individual as well. So it's hard. I mean, it's hard to compare between individuals. Generally, higher is better, but yours at 80 is still actually a very high number. You know, you're talking high and very high. So, but what we typically find is that it's comparing the heart variability within yourself. So it's looking at changes to your norm and changes within your normal day-to-day variation. And there's more to it than just a higher value is better. Like with athletes, you typically want to look for higher and more stable values. So also the day-to-day variation in athletes is generally shows they're not coping as well with the training. So there's more to it than just pure that number on that given day. Like typically when I'm working with the athletes that I work with, I'll be looking at 7-day rolling averages and that day-to-day variation, and looking at it within a small, what we call the smallest worthwhile change, which is it's looking at that your day-to-day variation generally, and seeing and putting almost thresholds, upper and lower thresholds around where it's changing, and what's going to be deemed as actually a substantial change.
What's the interplay between heart rate variability and resting heart rate? Are you looking to discard resting heart rate as a metric, or is it usable still in this new framework?
Yeah, it's definitely still usable. So, like, if you think parasympathetic activity, so more like rest and digest, higher parasympathetic activity is associated with a lower resting heart rate. So, generally, the two go hand in hand. They do have a linear relationship to a point. With people, some athletes who have really, really high or really, really low resting heart rate, so very high levels of parasympathetic activity, or vagal tone, as we call it, higher variability can actually go down. So it's kind of got this polynomial relationship. It's not straight linear. So at the top point, it becomes a little bit more confused. We call it HRV saturation, where your resting heart rate becomes so high, vagal tone is so high that HRV actually drops. So I will always be looking at resting heart rate at the same time as HRV, particularly in elite athletes, because sometimes if you have a sudden drop in HRV with a drop in resting heart rate, I wouldn't be so bothered as if I had a sudden drop in HRV with an increase in resting heart rate. The great thing about HRV compared to resting heart rate is that we always talk about this kind of signal to noise ratio, in that like HRV will change a lot. It has a very high signal. So that means that through any type of stressor, any change in diet, anything that's causing a change in behavior, you'll generally see a change in HRV almost instantaneously, like the next day. Whereas resting heart rate is a little
better and worse.
Yeah, better and worse, exactly. Yeah, but you won't necessarily see that in resting heart rate. So the noise is a bit more in HRV. So that means that the measure can change a little bit more in a kind of a technical error of estimate way. But the signal is much greater. So it's much better for athletes because you will see changes on a day-to-day basis. Whereas resting heart rate, something has to be really awry to see a substantial change. So if we published a paper on this, and me and Marco Altini, who's the owner of HRV for Training, we published a paper on this that says, if you see a sudden increase in resting heart rate, then you're in a bit of trouble. You definitely want to take a rest day. Whereas if you see a sudden decrease in HRV, it's probably not as severe because it doesn't take as much to shift it. If that makes sense.
It's nearly like the relationship when you started using a power meter for the first time and you were trying to explain to somebody the difference between a power meter and a heart rate monitor. You're trying to explain to them that, look, your heart rate monitor lags behind the effort. So as soon as you put in a stimulus, your power reading's going to go up, but maybe your heart rate won't catch up for a couple of minutes later. Is that a fair way to interpret it, where HRV, if I have a night on the beer, it's going to be instantly affected, whereas my rest and heart rate might take a couple of days to catch up if I have a repeated stimulus?
Not really. It's not the lag. It's so much it's the potency of the stimulus. So if I gave you 2 beers, right, the next day you might see a small change in your HRV, no change in your resting heart rate. But if I gave you 10 beers, which, would be very generous to do that, you probably would then see a change in your resting heart rate because it takes just more of a stimulus, more to make that same response in HRV. So things have to be much worse. So you kind of have to be a little bit more over the edge to see a change in your resting heart rate, which is a problem, right? Whereas you can make interventions and changes with HRV much more easily and much more quickly based on small differences. So a little bit, 2 or 3 days of high intensity training, you would likely see a change in your HRV. You might not see a change in your resting heart rate.
I've definitely field tested that one with about 14 beers over in Girona last week. Well, the next day the data wasn't looking too good at all.
There you go. Yeah. And about that, it definitely shows alcohol's a real one to really kick out your HRV, that's for sure.
But that's actually an interesting segue, because I remember one of the first books I read on training, and it was by Joe Friel. Cyclists Training Bible. I'm not sure if you remember it, but in it, Joe Friel advocates this morning check-in. And the morning check-in is like rate, I can't remember his scale. I think it was 1 to 5. Rate 1 to 5, your fatigue, your readiness to train, all these different areas. And this is what I often wonder with data. Is data, is it a proxy to like understanding our own bodies, and it's starting to drown out the actual voice we should be listening to? Like, how do we feel? Like when I wake up in the morning after having 14 beers, I know I feel like shit. I don't really need my Whoop to tell me I feel like shit. But we're getting a generation of athletes now who are so dependent on that data. And anecdotally, I've had some of my best performances when the data says I feel like shit, but I didn't check it till after.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I always say that no measure is a silver bullet. It's just to reduce uncertainty in the decisions that you're making with training, right? It's not to make a decision for you. And I would never depend on one measure to make a decision either. I think you have to have multiple things coming in at one time. So, HRV is a prime example. If you like, I had this example. I was training quite a lot this year. I was still competing in Ironman, and I've got young kids, and I'd often wake up with like a bit of a head cold, a bit of a sniffle, right? And my HRV was fine during this period, so I would just train straight through because I kind of knew that there was nothing that was causing any kind of change in my internal physiology. My resting heart rate was normal, my HRV was normal, but I still felt a little bit snivelly and a little bit of a head cold, but I carried on training and I was totally fine. Whereas if that happened to me and my HRV was low, or my resting heart rate was high at the same time, I would definitely have done easy training or stopped training. So I don't think you can't just depend on one thing. It's a few things that you have to look at, and like all measures, there's nothing that's the silver bullet that can make all decisions for you. I think it's you have to use it within your own intuition as well. You can't fall out of your own whatever it might be. And it's just exactly the same with exercise prescription. I always say that exercise prescription, people have gone away from heart rate and they've gone away from feeling, they just use power. And it's in cycling, for example. And I always think you've got to always be in touch with the Holy Grail. And I call it the Holy Grail because I call it like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, which is the Father's the power, the Son's the heart rate, and the Holy Ghost is how you're feeling. You have to be in touch with all those three things at one time. It's the same for the response and the recovery. You can't just go, oh, look at my HRV. It's pants today. I'm not going to do any training. But, you might think, well, I feel fine. I'm going to give it a go.
What a catch.
Roadman, you know how serious I take my goal setting, and I know how serious you take it too. So whether you're chasing fitness or lifestyle goals, and you're looking for a powerful ally to support you on this journey, look no further than Huel. Huel has become my secret weapon for when I don't have time to prepare a balanced meal. It means I get the nutrition I need without sacrificing time or taste, plus it stops me from reaching for the takeaway menu. I always throw a bottle of this banana into my backpack when I'm heading into the city, and it stops me eating junk convenience foods that don't support my training goals. It's handy, it's nutritious, it's 22 grams of protein. It's perfect for athletes that don't have time to cook or prepare food before a training session. It's convenient, nutritious fuel at your fingertips, ensuring you hit your daily fueling needs. Huel Ready to Drink has over 26 essential vitamins and minerals in every bottle, making sure you get 175 health benefits. Plus, it's made from amazing natural ingredients like sunflower seed, coconut, and more. And the best part, 8 mouth-watering flavours. My favourite's the banana. That's what's in my backpack at the moment. You can get Huel direct to your home by going to huel.com/roadman. That's Huel, HUEL.com/roadman.
Spoke with Matej Mohoric a few days ago, and Tour de France stage winner, he's world gravel champion at the moment, and he's coming into that sort of period of his career where he's definitely not a veteran, but he's experienced. He's a decade plus in the World Tour peloton now, and won stages in all the Grand Tours. But I was asking him about the number one lesson he's learned over that time, and he said the number one lesson he's learned is that training is meant to make you get faster for races. And I thought it was such a simple insight that we all, well, at least I did for a long time, lose sight of. You get hung up on hitting a specific target. You get hung up on a specific time or a specific pace if you're running, or specific splits if you're in the pool. And you forget that the function of training is actually to make you better for a race day, not just to train for train's sake.
And sometimes you just got to get it done right, no matter, even if you're a bit off. Like, you don't have to be perfect all the time. And I think we live in a day where we have all this objective data coming back to us, and I think it, this saying that you never let perfection stand in the way of progress, but because we have all these metrics and objective metrics in front of us, we have to be perfect. It's like, oh my God, I'm doing 300 watts and I can only hold 290, and then we don't do the session, but I see this all the time in the athletes that I coach, and I'm like, just if it's really bothering you, just go and feel, because you just do it. Just get the session done. It doesn't have to be perfect all the time, because at the end of the day, you're going through the motions and it's just making you better for race day. So
I thought it was really interesting where you were talking about rolling 7-day totals for heart rate variability. I haven't heard that used before. Can we use a system like that, or how would you set up a system like that to predict and prevent overtraining?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been, just to go back a little bit, there's been some great research that's been done in heart rate variability guided training. And that basically, it looks at the early days, it looked at heart variability on a given day. So if your heart variability was high, you do high intensity training. If your heart variability was low, you do low intensity training. And it was shown to be very effective. But what I showed in my PhD is you actually, when it comes to, I do not believe or use single isolated day values. I will always use rolling averages and trends to look at things and make decisions in the data. So, and it's not just that, is that I'd look at the trend, I'd look at the rolling average, and I'd look at the day-to-day variation to make a decision in the training. So I coached Chelsea Sodaro, who was the 2023 Women's Ironman World Champion. And a few weeks ago, she had a downward trend, high variability, and it was definitely flagging red. So we made some adjustments to training. So the problem is with day values, it's often, like you said, it can make you change your training when you probably don't need to. And this can happen a lot in particularly in periods where you have excessive changes in blood plasma volume, so hypervolemia. So if you'll know that you'll have experienced this, is that when you do a really, really long, slow ride and it's hot, the next day you can wake up and your heart variability is absolutely skyrocketed. And the reason being is because you have an increase in blood plasma volume. The blood plasma volume affects the bioreceptors, and that in turn affects your HRV. And you have all of this, almost this false positive, which is why what we showed is that if you if you average things over time, you make a much more informed decision, and those decisions are generally better. We published this in the International Journal of Applied Physiology with 2 overtrained athletes, and we showed that if you just base on the single day, you could get any number. But if you look at the rolling average over time, it starts to paint a much better picture.
Very interesting. Where do you think that sits with a trend in World Tour cycling that I've seen emerging in the last year or so? Certain coaches are allocating sessions to be done in the 7-day period, but they're not saying what days they should be done on. So they're saying, here's the work you need to get through for the week. Now you decide what day you want to do your speed session. You decide what day you want to do your endurance session. So an athlete wakes up and they're like, okay, I feel like going long today. Oh, I feel like I have a bit of zip in my legs. I'm going to go fast today.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of smarts in that, and that it does make some sense if in a world tour level cyclist, but I don't think it would work in an amateur cyclist because they're just not as in tune with their body. I think if you're a highly trained professional, it can definitely be very advantageous. And it's going towards the HRV for training, guided training, right? HRV guided training. Like the latest studies that have also had success moved away from the single day values and they've gone into the rolling averages. And they've also shown to be really effective. And generally, you're finding that athletes are going better doing HRV guided training based on rolling averages when doing less training. So you have the two groups. The guys who did the HRV guided training did less training load, but yet they still improved more. And I think that goes to show you get more bang. If you can get as much bang for your buck from every training session, you're getting more out of it. Of course, it's going to make a massive difference to how you're going. And I think in pro tour level cyclists, if they're in tune with their body enough, it can definitely be highly effective if they can do that.
How are you tracking this? Is there a specific software for you, or you're just going old school spreadsheets?
No. There's a very specific software for it. So you can see here I have a Whoop on my wrist, and I did have an Oura ring on my finger, but it's charging at the moment. And I use both of those to collect my data. I wear both because sometimes my Oura ring runs out of battery, like it did last night, and then I go back to my Whoop, or vice versa. But what I do is with that data, I will put it into an app called HRV for Training, and that HRV for Training, and then they have a coach's app, and that coach's app is based on my my PhD work, and that's what I use to monitor my athletes. And it kind of you have really good trends and rolling averages in there, which is what I use mainly.
I'm definitely going to check that out. I'm thinking about, as you're chatting, is there a prescriptive way to use HRV in terms of the block periodization? We talked about a lot of the microstructure day to day. If we zoom out and look on more of a macro overview, does it have an application?
Yeah, it does for sure. I've written a course on the use of HRV for endurance training. By the way, if anyone is interested in that.
If you ping me a link to that, I'll put that into the show notes and stuff as well.
I'll share it with you. I think you'll definitely find it interesting. But one of the things is Visturinen, who did some research in this, and it depends what type of block periodization. Like typical block periodization, where you're doing high density of sessions, where you might do 1 week of pure endurance, or 3 weeks of pure endurance, and then 1 week of pure high intensity, kind of like the Ronestad model, if you know what that is. He's quite famous for that very high density block periodization. But what's been shown is that the response of individuals it seems to be quite dependent on the HRV. So if you're starting an interval block with a higher HRV, so you might do low intensity training, because we know that low intensity training builds up your HRV. High intensity training brings down your HRV, which is why it's really good to have this kind of balance. The 80-20 balance that you always talk about, polarized model or whatever it might be, when you're doing the predominantly lower intensity training, that's having the effect of building up your parasympathetic activity, getting you ready for the high intensity, and then you do the high intensity and it drives down your HRV. So if you did day to day high intensity, eventually HRV would be very low. But what we found in research is that when HRV is high, you seem to go better with the high intensity training. So you could do a block where you do low intensity training to get your HRV as high as you possibly can. When it's at a high period and you've done all that low intensity, you can start a higher intensity block. So
that's class, because it struck me for a long time. We referenced the Joe Friel book back in the day, but a lot of people are still training like that, where it's week 1, week 2 builds on week 1, week 3 builds on that, and then week 4 is like almost a total rest. And I'd be always saying to lads, like, if you need to take a total rest in week 4, like, you've got something badly wrong in the amount of training you've done in weeks 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, if I have to say, I never ever take recovery periods anymore. Like small periods, like 1 or 2 days, but never a week. I think that old like mesocycle 3-1, 2-1 is so old school now, and I fully believe that if you're going that deep, you've probably gone a little bit too hard. Yeah.
What effect would mid-season breaks, end of season breaks have on HRV values?
Yeah, so typically, like, we know that exercise training is such a stimulus for changing in HRV, right? So if you're taking a bit of a break and a bit of an off season, you won't expect it to suddenly start increasing unless you've been really tanked in the season. So it's a good sign and a good way to measure things. So if you suddenly start resting and your HRV starts increasing, you have been definitely overcooking it on the season. Because generally what should happen is the moment you take your foot off the gas and you stop training, you should lose a bit of condition and your HRV would actually come down a little bit, not go back up. If it's the opposite, you've probably been a little bit too overcooked in your training in the lead up, because we know it's so responsive to endurance training.
Circling back to the start, you mentioned that these were all-cause mortality predictors. So initially they're medical grade equipment, and now we have consumer wearables like you referenced, or Whoop. I'm sure there are others, but they're the main two people are familiar with. How do those consumer grade ones stack up against the medical grade?
Yeah, I published a paper in the International Journal of Applied Physiology and Performance, and we compared the Polar heart rate monitor to like PPG technology, which is actually taking HRV from the camera phone. So just putting your finger on the back of the camera phone. And
I've seen that one. It just seemed like wizardry. It seemed like some Harry Potter shit, so I didn't trust it, and I just that can't work.
But it was actually it's highly accurate, and it's very close to ECG. And the benefit
Seriously?
so if you're going to go, the very best way you can possibly take HRV is actually first thing in the morning when you wake up and do it yourself, rather than it's better than taking it through the night, because you remove a bit of your night's sleep having an effect on the HRV measure. It is taken all the way through the night, so it's not saying it's bad, but if you're going to take one, that would be the one that I would take. But most people don't really like to do it because it requires you to wake up and remember to take it. So with athletes, because it's just so important to have good adherence to taking the measure, it's just easier to have a Whoop or an Oura Ring. But yeah, they're all really close, and they're all excellent in terms of validity. But the difference is, and I always say this, is that you can have something as valid and reliable as you like, but if you haven't got the interpretation of the data right, it doesn't matter how valid and reliable it is. So that's why I think where you put that data and how it's interpreted and what it shows is this just as, if not more important than how reliable and valid that data is. But they're all Whoop, Oura, they all have very good HRV data.
But interpretation of data is a rolling frustration of mine at the moment. Like, I had Super Sapiens for a while, and again, it was just more data, and I was very much left to interpret this myself. And as a busy person balancing conflicting demands on my time, it's like, oh yeah, sure, I could dig into this data and figure out how to use it, but I couldn't make it a priority. So it just became another number that I kind of glanced at. And even times when I did make an effort to understand it, where I'd be like, okay, I'm going to weigh and measure my breakfast this morning and see what effect it has. And if 50 grams of oats or something in the morning and it has X effect on my blood sugar, then I'd have the next morning 50 grams of oats again, and it's a totally different effect on my blood sugar. And then I learn, okay, well, sleep plays a factor in this. So I think the next era in this data is going to be increased interpretation for consumers.
Yeah, and it's a really tricky one, because I think when it comes to like data, I always think of this aspect of simple, complex, simple. So if if I say, okay, Anthony, we're going to learn about HRV, right? And I've explained it to you as we've explained on this podcast. Most people listening will think, oh, okay, that seems quite simple. But but it's only simple because I have got into the complex, and now I can explain it in simple terms, right? If you really got into it, it's actually a very, very, very complex area when you look at all the different spectral analysis, the time domain analysis, and everything that's intertwined with it. But I do think we get to the point where, especially with wearables, where we're bringing it to the mass consumer, we're oversimplifying it. And, it's been, and Whoop and Aura and lots of other wearables, they've been really trying to do a great job at making, the daily scores, the recovery scores, the percentages. But, there's just been a great paper that's just been brought out that says, the recovery scores aren't really showing you anything. There's a paper in Elite Swimmers, but the HRV was great. So I think it's just, it's really hard, and it's really hard to get it right. But I totally agree with you. There is a need to make that interpretation better, but I also think there's a danger of trying to get it too simple, and then it doesn't mean much. I think there's always going to be an element of complexity within something that is reasonably complex.
Athletes forever have known the importance of sleep, but in the last couple of years, I think it's really post-COVID where the general public is getting more tuned into the importance of health. Sleep is one of those areas. Maybe it's Matt Walker's book, Why We Sleep, that's kind of popularized it, but it just seems to be getting more and more press time at the moment. What's the interplay of HRV and sleep? Like, how much can I affect my HRV scores with good or bad night's sleep?
Yeah, so we when I was at Triathlon New Zealand, we did a study with the triathletes, and we looked at like sleep hours and HRV, and it was almost a direct relationship, to be honest. Like, it's
that's what I find. It just seems that anecdotal for me.
Yeah, it's really important. One is it's not just the hours, but also the quality. So, and I think if you're always when you talk about athlete recovery and the ways to improve the athlete's recovery, is that I always think of the three pillars of recovery would be training periodization. So making sure you're not doing stupid amounts of training and stacking high intensity day in, day out, sleep, and then nutrition, right? Those three things are the three pillars, and all the other things are just like little supporting structures. But all those three things will have a massive implication on your HRV as well. So you get your training intensity distribution right, you get your nutrition right, you get your sleep right. They all play massive parts in your in one another, and they also, and I would say, sleep and exercise also directly affect your sleep and nutrition and exercise affect your sleep as well. So if you exercise too hard, you exercise too late at night, it affects your sleep. If you have a poor diet, you don't have the right nutrients, it also affects your sleep. So sleep's kind of like really important, but the outcome is the HRV. So if you can affect the exercise and the nutrition to have helped you sleep, you'll get a better HRV score. And I think that's where athletes really need to spend their time. I don't really believe in overtraining. I think it's I think most of the time, and in all my experience, poor HRV scores always come from something additional to overtraining. Poor sleep, too much stress, whatever it might be.
So I'm going to stick you on the spot to optimize my evening routine for me, right? So at the moment, for kind of sleep hygiene evening routine, I'm kind of getting off devices at about 45 minutes before bed, stopping looking at screens. My catalyst for doing that is when I mix up my bottle of pillar for the evening and have that about 35 to 40 minutes before I go to sleep. Knock that back while I'm reading. I've tried to stop reading because I'm a brutal for just reading self-help books, productivity, business type stuff, which I find just gets the mind spinning again. So I'm trying to move to trying to read a bit more fiction and kind of chewing gum for the brain stuff. And then in the bedroom, it is quite cool, but I don't have any tech for this. It's just literally windows open, blackout curtains, eye mask, earplugs, good comfortable mattress. What could I be doing better?
I think there's a few great things that you're doing in there. One thing there's a few things on devices you can set. I set my phone up to do 3 clicks and it turns it into a night mode. So I do that. I'll do that quite early on in the night. I think you can do it a lot more because you still need to use your phone, but you can turn it on to night shift on your phone, which is an orange screen. You could do that from 5:30, 6 o'clock. So I'll try and do that early. Usually start the process a little bit earlier. One thing, if you can do it, is things like sauna. Really good for sleep if you have
Just
that
stuck
available.
one in the apartment last year.
Yeah,
Absolutely brilliant.
So I do that before bed every night. I find it really, really helps. And then finishing off with a short cold shower. You don't want to get it to be too cold because you end up being a little bit hot. I mean, the triple magnesium from Pillar that you discussed is, from our data in HRV, absolute game changer. So it really does. We've seen so many times, and we're trying to do a bit more research in some professional cycling teams. It really has been shown to improve sleep quality and improve HRV the next day. And in athletes, most athletes are not sufficient in magnesium. So they lose a lot through sweat and urine. Just about every single enzyme that's involved in stress responses takes up some magnesium. So, and we don't produce it ourselves. And if you're not using it or you're not replenishing it in some form, it will affect your sleep because it triggers serotonin, and the serotonin is really important for melatonin. So yeah, super important, and it makes a massive difference. So definitely, anyone like a magnesium supplement before bed, really important. I mean, the one that we have at Pillar is more widely readily available, and it's specifically designed for athletes, and we find some really good implications of that. And I also think just that nightly routine as well, because it's a flavored drink, like hygiene and routine is everything. And I think it just sets your mind up for a little bit of rest, which is much better than taking a pill. Because you take a pill, you don't get that same taste in your mouth. And I think that's actually also has some kind of knock-on effect. So that's really another one. Another thing that I find really helps me is a Shakti mat. Have you ever used one of those?
No, what's that called? Say again.
A Shakti mat. So a Shakti mat is like it's like a bed of nails, basically. Really good.
Sounds comfortable.
Yeah, but it is. So you lie on it and it's really painful to start with, but then it just goes, and then you just if my mind is racing, I find that's the one thing that can really settle me down to go to sleep. Is that
so you're sleeping on this bed of nails? I feel like this is a Bon Jovi lyric.
Yeah. So I'll put it. I have it by my bed, and the first thing I do is when I get into bed, I put it on my bed and I lie on it for 5 minutes. And by the time 5 minutes is coming up, I'm kind of almost asleep. It's just sending me to sleep. So then I'll just put it on the floor and roll over and go straight to sleep. So I find that's it's really good. And the last thing that I think has been a real game changer for me is I got a sleep 8. Have you heard of those?
Yeah, I have. I've heard everyone that has one absolutely loves it. It's like that. How do you know someone's done an Ironman? Because they tell you. It's like that with that. Everyone that has it tells me they have one.
Yeah. They are brilliant. They're so good, and especially if you're quite a hot sleeper, and I'm a bit of a hot sleeper. It's made a massive difference. Like I just love it, and especially now it's summer here in New Zealand. We don't have to put any aircon on at night, and with the aircon you kind of with the sleep 8 you can set it for different temperatures during the night, and it'll go through as you go through your sleep routine. It'll kind of get a little bit warmer. So I have it. You can set it like really cold when you get into bed. So I set it at a really cold temperature, so it's really cold nice to get into bed to. But when you have the aircon on, you wake up at the night and you're freezing cold, right? Because the room's so cold. But with this, because it's like increasing the temperature as you sleep, you don't get that, and it's great. Yeah, it's been one of the best investments ever, I have to say. So
I had James Nestor on the podcast, and he was talking about mouth taping. Does that affect HRV?
It will do, yeah. Mainly because of something called the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So when you tape your mouth, you breathe more nasally, and you're longer on the exhale. And that when you exhale, you affect the HRV. So that's when you're predominantly parasympathetic when you're doing your exhale. So if you look at your resting heart rate, you do a really long exhale, resting heart rate gradually comes down, because that's the point where you're predominantly parasympathetic, and acetylcholine is going onto the receptors that's slowing down heart rate. So by wearing a mouthpiece, you will change your breathing pattern, and that will affect your HRV. And I think indirectly, because you're predominantly parasympathetic, it's going to change your HRV for the better. And nose breathing is definitely it's a healthy habit to have. I try and nose breathe as much as I can in the day. I mean, I've tried it a little bit when exercising, but now I've just gone to just being more cognizant of it during the day and just nose breathing when I'm at my desk and doing things like that. But I haven't tried it sleeping yet, I have to say. I had when I was working for Emirates Team New Zealand, we had one of our athletes got really into it, and he was doing VO2 max sessions, nose breathing. It's crazy.
Yeah, I've talked to World Tour riders as well who are doing threshold efforts, like 400 watts, like with the mount tape and stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's amazing. I find it much harder cycling than running. I think it's because you're a bit you're bent over and the diaphragm's a little bit more crushed in the cycling position. Running is easier than cycling, I find.
The problem with all this stuff is, like, my missus already thinks I'm batshit crazy, like tape my mouth. Now you want me to sleep on a bed of nails going to sleep at night.
You should try it. I have to say, I mentioned chatting about on another podcast, and the amount of people who messaged me about it after, I think I should have shares in that company. I've given them that much custom, to be honest. But yeah, you should try it, because especially if you're finding that you're doing work late. I used to have a lot of late night calls when I used to work with a company in Europe, so I would often get off calls very late, and I needed to get to sleep, and I often couldn't. But the Shakti mat changed it for me. I don't know if it's because you're so focused on the pain on your back for that first period of time that you're just like meditating it out. Yeah. There's different levels.
Some sadomasochistic shit.
Yeah, you start off with the baby one. There's different levels of how sharp it is. So,
have you tried just getting your missus to like whip you before you're going to sleep at night? See if that pain helps.
I can try.
Yeah. Just to finish up, what do you think the future of HRV holds? Is there anything emerging that you're excited about? Everyone's raving about AI at the moment. Is there an AI application for this, or what direction do you see it going?
Yeah, I think the world, definitely AI will eventually come into it. I think there's always going to be a bit of human interpretation, regardless of what's going on. So yeah, I think the AI will hopefully make, what we talked about earlier, is that interpretation's the most important thing, and I think maybe AI will help with some interpretation for athletes. So, if you can put like my brain, who knows a lot about HRV, into an AI platform that can look at the data and give you some informed decisions based on that, I think that would be really good. And I don't really think anyone's doing that at the moment. I do believe that would be the next step forward. My feeling is that with all training, I always think it's like, okay, if you're a coach, if you're an athlete, what things do you need to know to perform better? And it's really actually very simple, and it's stimulus and response. So with any monitoring, it's like, first, what is the stimulus? Is that stimulus correct? And when we talk about stimulus, like, is the intensity correct? Is the duration correct? Is the timing of the intervals correct? Is the recovery correct? So is that eliciting the right response? Generally, most coaches are pretty good at that, and most coaches do a pretty good job at measuring that as well, right? With power meters, with heart rate meters, with training peaks, today's plan, whatever it might be, they're all measuring that. But most of them are terrible at the response. If you have the correct stimulus and you know that the response is great, so in this case, you might have, okay, I know my stimulus is correct, and in the response, the HRV's trending up. There's low day-to-day variation. I'm getting good subjective feedback, and they're doing the sessions well. The response is good. If you have those two things right, you can't go wrong. There's no way you're not going to improve through training. And I think that's the simplicity of where we need to get to. Is we need to have the response side as easy and understandable as the stimulus side is that we have at the moment.
Dan, I think this has been a valuable contribution, because I've listened to a lot of stuff on HRV, and I've always went away with more questions than I have answers. Today, for the first time, I actually feel like I have answers rather than questions. Thanks very much.
You got to ask the right. You have to get to ask the questions this time, so I hope so.
Thanks, pal.
Thank you.